Hi everyone, welcome to another Donna Downey Studios Artist Gang Tuesday. My name is Andrea Walford and I'm so excited to be a part of Donna's Artist Gang. Now for my first project, I'm going to show you how I created this 12 by 16 canvas because she chooses to see the world in bright, bold colors. So my first step was to add some visual interest to my canvas by taking my numbers repetitive Donna Downey stencil and some of my Liquitex Carbon Black professional spray paint, and then just lightly spraying through the stencil several times in several areas of my canvas. So in order to pull back those numbers a little bit, I applied a combination of heavy-bodied as well as fluid titanium white acrylic paint using a large brayer. Now this also gave my canvas some texture. Once my acrylic paint was dry, I started building my layers of color a little bit at a time using a combination of India inks as well as some Daler Rowney pearlescent fluid acrylic. And I simply did that by spritzing my canvas with water, applying a few drops of 2 colors of ink at a time, and then using a wet paintbrush to blend it out a little bit. And then by tilting my canvas gently back and forth side to side, I let the colors blend a little bit, but not completely mix, because I did want them to maintain the distinct individual colors. So once my base layer of color was completely dry, I then took my Donna Downey Collage Portrait stencil and just used the face portion of the stencil. I traced around the left edge and then used a sponge and a little bit of my Carbon Black fluid acrylic to pounce on the inner features. Now before I actually started painting and shading my face, I started off by applying a layer of gesso over top of that bright colorful background so that any of the mediums that I applied over top afterwards would show their true color. So in order to paint a dimensional face, you need to build shadows and highlights into your image. And I initially did that by working with 3 different colors of acrylic paint. My mid-tone, which was my skin tone, I used the Amsterdam Expert Acrylic Naples Yellow Red Light. And then for highlights, I simply used some of the gesso, so the same thing that I coated for my base layer. And then for some of my shadows, I used my Golden Fluid Acrylic Raw Sienna. And I just worked with an angled brush and just started alternately working between the different colors. So it's really a process of going back and forth, back and forth. You add some shadows. If you add too much shadow, you add some more highlight. So you just kind of keep working on the face until you get a look that you're happy with. Because there's so much back and forth involved in shading a face, going between your highlights, your shadows, your midtones, oftentimes once I have an initial layer, I might move on to another element or work on additional elements of the face before going back and continuing with shading. So here I decided to add some colors to the eyes, and for that I used the Montana Paint Pen Shock Green Light. And I chose a color that went with the colors that I had applied to the background of my canvas. And then I just took some time to add in some of the additional details. Now again, I go back several times throughout the process and keep working on it, but I like to sort of build it out a little at a time. And as I said, I kind of move back and forth between working on different elements of the face. So once I'd worked on the eyes for a bit, I then went back to shading. So now usually at some point as I'm working on shading the face, I'll tend to pause and then add in the hair. And I think I do this to kind of help me create a little bit of quiet space around the face. So to kind of block out that riot of color that's pressed right up against the skin, and it helps me kind of better visualize how I want the shading of the skin to appear. So to create my very first layer of the hair, and I do, as with the skin, I continue to work on the hair, but that first layer I used the golden heavy-bodied raw umber, and I simply applied it with a wide flat Simply Simmons paintbrush. So once I had my first layer for the hair in place, I then continued on just by painting in that neckline. And I started off the same way as I did with the face. I first covered that bright color with a layer of gesso, and then from there I added my shading using the same colors of paints that I did for the face. So now typically if I'm working in acrylics, the finishing touches for my shading and additional little details that I might add to the image will tend to come from my Faber-Castell Pitt pens. And I use both the smaller size and the big brush pens. And the reason I choose my Pitt pens is because the ink inside is India ink. So it's a waterproof ink. Once it's dry, it's completely permanent, but it stays wet for a little bit, which allows you to take a damp finger and just kind of blend it out or smooth it out a little bit. But then once it dries, it's completely permanent, so it's not going to get reactivated by any additional layers that go on top. Now the other thing that I absolutely love about them, of course, is that they are translucent. So you can see through them to the layers below. So they're fantastic for creating depth in your images. So just a quick note about the mouth here. You may remember that the top lip was a solid black, and that was from the stencil that we originally used. Now, because I didn't actually want the top lip to be black, but wanted to help use that black to create a little bit of shadow on the lip for me, I used the same technique as I did for the face and neck. I started off by applying a coat of gesso, and then used my big brush pens on top of that. So now once I had finished with the shading of my face, I then took my She Chooses Donna Downey stencil and I applied a very thin layer of my Liquitex light modeling paste through it using a palette knife, and then I set that aside to dry for a few hours. To create the flower for her hair, I mixed a little bit of my Liquitex light modeling paste with some of my magenta Bombay India ink just to give it that pretty pink color, and then applied it with my palette knife through my Donna Downey peony stencil. Now, because the stencil has a lot of peonies and I only wanted the single flower, I carefully masked off the flowers around it just using a little bit of Scotch tape. As the modeling paste dried with a little bit of a dull color, I decided to try to brighten up my sentiment by layering the stencil back on top and then carefully pouncing a little bit of my heavy-bodied titanium white paint over top. Once my flower had completely dried, my next step was to apply a layer of gesso in between the petals, kind of as a base color. I then painted on top of that with my golden fluorescent magenta, and then using my fingers just added some highlights with the golden fluorescent pink, both heavy-bodied acrylics. Now once I had done that, I then again dipped my finger in a little bit of white gesso and brushed it on top just to give the flower a bit of highlights. And my final step was to apply a layer of soft gel gloss just to give it a little bit of sheen, and then sprinkle on some clear German glass glitter. Now to finish up my canvas, I added some highlighting with some coordinating colors of my Faber-Castell Pitt pens. And I had done some of that inside the sweater, kind of all around the edges and then going all around her head, just applying little bits of the color and then blending it out with my finger. And that just kind of helped her pop off the canvas a little bit more and give her a little bit more depth and dimension. So that, in a nutshell, is how I created my canvas. Now, of course, I realize that a canvas that takes 4 and a bit hours to make in real life is pretty hard to condense into an 8-minute video, but I hope that in walking you through the various steps that I used, you got a good idea of how this all came together.